Hello there, precious soul who has found your way to this gentle harbor tonight. I can sense in the very fact that you've paused here, in this quiet sanctuary we've created together, that you carry within your heart the accumulated weight of days that have asked much of you, perhaps more than seems fair for any one person to bear alone. Welcome to this sacred space where time moves differently, where the relentless pace of your everyday world gives way to rhythms as old as the human heart itself. Rhythms that speak of rest and renewal, and the kind of deep peace that touches places in your spirit you may have forgotten even existed. You who have arrived here tonight, whether this is your first time discovering this peaceful refuge, or you have returned like a traveler coming home to a place that has sheltered you before, know that your presence here is no accident, but rather the natural response of a heart that recognizes its need for something beyond what the rushing world can offer. There is something beautiful about the way weary souls find each other in spaces like this, drawn together not by shared circumstances, but by shared recognition that we were created for more than the endless cycle of worry and work that so often defines our waking hours. Take a moment now to simply notice where you are, to feel the surface that supports you completely, whether it is the familiar comfort of your own bed, or a chair that has become your evening sanctuary. Allow your body to remember what it feels like to be held, to be supported without having to earn that support through effort or achievement. Your physical form has served you faithfully throughout this day, carrying you through conversations and responsibilities, through moments of joy and periods of challenge, and now it can finally rest. Finally remember that it was designed not for endless striving, but for peaceful dwelling in the love that sustains all existence. Let us breathe together now, you and I, sharing these moments of conscious connection with the gift of life itself. Breathe in slowly through your nose, allowing your lungs to fill completely with air that carries more than oxygen, air that carries possibility and hope and the whispered promise that rest is not only possible but necessary for souls like yours that give so much of themselves in service to others and to the demands of daily life. Hold this breath gently, not with tension but with the tender care you might use to cradle something precious. And now release it slowly through your mouth, breathing out not just carbon dioxide, but the accumulated stress of hours that required more strength than you sometimes felt you possessed. Again, drawing in peace with each inhalation, drawing in the assurance that this moment belongs entirely to you and to the love that brought you here. Filling your chest with more than air, filling it with recognition that you are held by something infinitely larger and more tender than your troubles, infinitely more reliable than your own efforts to hold everything together. And as you exhale, release all the things you have been trying to control, all the outcomes you have been worried about, all the people you have been trying to help or fix or understand, letting them go into hands far more capable than yours, hands that have been caring for souls like yours since before time began. One more breath now, deeper and slower still, breathing in the knowledge that your presence in this quiet space is exactly where you need to be. That your journey here represents not escape from reality, but entry into a deeper reality, where love is the fundamental force and grace is the prevailing atmosphere. Feel your lungs expanding with acceptance, with the revolutionary understanding that you do not have to earn your rest or prove your worthiness to receive comfort, that you are beloved simply because you exist, cherished not for what you do but for who you are. And as you release this breath, let go of today's disappointments and tomorrow's anxieties, dwelling fully in this sacred now where healing happens and hope takes root in hearts that had almost forgotten how to believe in the goodness of divine love. Notice how your breathing has begun to find its own perfect rhythm without any effort on your part, like waves finding their natural cadence against an ancient shore, like a heart settling into the steady beat of someone who knows they are completely safe. This is the beginning of the deep rest your spirit has been craving, the kind of peace that does not depend on external circumstances, but wells up from within when we remember our connection to the source of all comfort and hope. You are not alone in this peaceful gathering tonight, dear friend. Across our world, other hearts like yours have been drawn to this same sanctuary. Other souls who understand what it means to feel overwhelmed by the complexity of modern existence. Other spirits who hunger for the kind of nourishment that cannot be found in any earthly provision, but flows abundantly from the wellspring of divine love. Some who join us tonight have been walking paths of contemplation for many years, their hearts familiar with these rhythms of grace, but always eager for fresh encounters with the love that first captured their attention. Others may be newer to this kind of spiritual exploration, their souls cautiously opening to possibilities they may have dismissed before, drawn by longings they can barely name but cannot ignore. Whether you arrive as a seasoned pilgrim or a curious newcomer, whether your faith feels strong tonight or fragile, whether you come with gratitude or with questions, with hope or with weariness that runs deeper than physical exhaustion, you belong here completely. The very fact that you have chosen to spend these precious evening hours in contemplation of eternal things speaks to something beautiful stirring within you, some deep recognition that your heart was made for more than the endless accumulation of achievements or possessions, made for connection with the love that created you and knows every detail of your unique story. Tonight we are embarking together on a journey that will transport us across centuries, to walk alongside the most extraordinary person who has ever lived, to witness love in its purest form as it moved through our world in human flesh, touching lives and transforming hearts in ways that continue to ripple through time. We will not observe these sacred events from academic distance, but will experience them as beloved friends, allowing our spirits to be transported by the power of story into the very presence of one whose name has been drawing seeking hearts for over 2,000 years. As we prepare to step backward through the corridors of history, feel yourself beginning to release your hold on the familiar markers of contemporary life, the digital devices and artificial lighting, the constant connectivity that keeps us tethered to a world that never stops demanding our attention. These sounds and sensations are fading now, becoming distant and unimportant as we prepare to enter a realm where time moved differently, where people measured their days by the sun's journey across the sky rather than the relentless ticking of clocks, where sacred and ordinary dwelt side by side without embarrassment. Chapter 2. Journey into Sacred Lands. The transformation begins gently, like dawn breaking over hills that have witnessed countless sunrises, as we find ourselves walking together along paths worn smooth by millions of sandaled feet, breathing air sweetened by herbs and flowers that grow wild in this ancient landscape we are entering. The harsh artificial lights of your modern world have given way to the softer, warmer illumination of Mediterranean sun, light that seems to carry within it something more than mere brightness, light that speaks of purposes larger than simple visibility, light that has warmed these particular stones and olive trees since the world was young. Feel the ground beneath your feet changing from the processed surfaces of contemporary life to the natural textures of earth and stone that have supported human steps for countless generations. These roads remember the footfalls of merchants traveling between distant cities with goods and stories, of shepherds leading their flocks to green pastures where still waters reflect sky and clouds, of ordinary people whose names history has forgotten, but whose faithfulness to daily love has left invisible impressions on the very soil we now walk together. This is the land of promise and preparation, where rolling hills stretch toward horizons painted in colors that no earthly artist has ever fully captured, where olive groves climb terraced slopes tended by families who understand their work as partnership with divine providence, where vineyards heavy with grape clusters speak of harvests that will bring joy to wedding celebrations and comfort to hearts that need the warmth of shared communion. The air itself seems alive with memory and meaning as we breathe together the clean, dry atmosphere of Palestine, scented with wild thyme and rosemary that grow along forgotten paths, touched with the smoke of cooking fires rising from villages built of stone that came from this very ground. These are communities where generations have learned the art of living in harmony with seasons and soil, where children play games that require nothing more than imagination and the simple joy of being alive in a world full of wonder. Listen carefully to the sounds that fill this sacred landscape, so different from the mechanical noise that surrounds most contemporary existence. The gentle bleating of sheep following their shepherd toward higher ground, where grass grows thick and water runs clear, their voices creating pastoral melodies that speak of trust and care, and the kind of security that comes from knowing you are led by one who loves you. From nearby villages comes the rhythmic sound of grain being ground between stones worn smooth by countless harvests, of water being drawn from wells that have served these communities since their ancestors first settled here, of mothers calling their children home as evening settles over hills that have sheltered human families since time beyond memory. The people of this land move with different quality than the hurried masses of our modern age. Their steps unhurried because they understand that the most important destinations are not geographical but spiritual. Their eyes clear because they have learned to see beauty in simple things. Their faces marked by sun and honest labor, but illuminated by something deeper than physical health. These are souls who have maintained connection to rhythms that govern natural life, who plant and harvest according to seasons they did not create, but have learned to trust, who understand their lives as part of a larger story being written by wisdom infinitely greater than their own understanding. You can observe them now as twilight begins to paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, families gathering around tables where bread and fish, olives and wine become the elements of communion that binds hearts together across generations. Their dwellings are humble, but their hospitality legendary. Their possessions few, but their gratitude profound. Their understanding simple, but their faith deep as wells that never run dry, even in seasons of drought. The religious life of these people flows seamlessly through every aspect of their daily existence, not compartmentalized into special buildings or designated hours, but woven through the fabric of ordinary moments like golden thread through simple cloth. Their prayers rise as naturally as their breathing, their awareness of divine presence as constant as their awareness of sunlight and air, their trust in providential care as fundamental as their confidence in the ground beneath their feet. The synagogues that serve as centers of their spiritual community are built of the same materials as their homes, designed for gathering rather than impressing, for learning rather than displaying, for fostering relationship with the divine rather than creating hierarchies among human beings. Here children learn the ancient stories that connect them to their heritage and their destiny. Here adults wrestle with questions that have challenged human hearts since the beginning of thought. Here voices join in songs and prayers that carry both individual longing and collective hope toward heaven, with confidence that they are heard and treasured by the one who created the very vocal cords that offer them. As darkness deepens over this ancient landscape and oil lamps begin to flicker in windows that glow with warm welcome rather than harsh illumination, you can sense anticipation in the very air itself, as if all creation holds its breath in expectation of something unprecedented, about to break into the predictable patterns of human history. The stars appearing one by one in the clear desert sky seem brighter and closer than any stars visible from your modern vantage point, and the moon rises with radiance that speaks of purposes beyond mere illumination, of light that carries meaning as well as visibility. This is the world into which we are about to encounter, one whose presence will transform everything, whose words will echo through centuries, and whose love will prove more powerful than death itself. But for now we simply rest in the beauty and peace of the time and place that shaped his human understanding, allowing ourselves to be prepared by its rhythms and its reverence for the kind of encounter that changes hearts and heals souls and restores hope to spirits that had almost forgotten how to believe in joy. Chapter 3. The Man from Nazareth. In the small hillside village of Nazareth, nestled among the green valleys of Galilee like a precious stone set in a crown of natural beauty, there lived a young man whose very presence seemed to alter the atmosphere around him. Though to casual observers he appeared remarkably similar to every other Jewish man of his time and region. His name was Jesus, and while his hands showed the honest calluses of years working with wood and stone, while his face bore the warm bronze of Mediterranean sun, and his eyes held the deep earth tones of the soil that nurtured him, there was something in his gaze that made people pause and look again. Something that spoke of depths beyond human measurement and love beyond human comprehension. He had grown up among these same winding streets where we find ourselves now, playing as a child beneath olive trees whose roots ran deeper than memory, learning his first lessons about life and love and the mysterious ways of divine providence from parents whose faithfulness had already marked them as extraordinary among their neighbors. Joseph, the village carpenter, had taught him that broken things could be mended with patience and skill, that rough materials could be transformed into objects of beauty and usefulness through careful attention and persistent dedication. Mary, his mother, had shown him through her own example what it meant to trust completely in purposes larger than human understanding, to say yes to divine plans, even when those plans challenged every conventional expectation. The workshop where Jesus had spent countless hours learning, Joseph's craft was filled with the sounds and scents that would forever remind him of the dignity of honest labor, the satisfaction that comes from creating something useful with one's own hands, the quiet joy of seeing potential realized through the marriage of vision and effort. Here among the wood shavings and careful measurements, among the tools worn smooth by generations of craftsmen and projects that would serve families for decades, Jesus absorbed lessons that would later blossom into teachings about building on solid foundations, about trees being known by their fruit, about the patience required for any work that truly matters. Even as a young boy, there had been something that distinguished Jesus from his companions in ways that only became clear when people reflected back years later with the gift of hindsight and deeper understanding. The village elders remembered conversations that seemed to carry weight beyond their simple words, questions that penetrated to the heart of matters they had never thought to examine so deeply. Responses that revealed insight far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect from someone of his age and experience. When he listened to ancient stories in the synagogue, his attention was so complete and his questions so penetrating that grown men found themselves reconsidering truths they thought they had mastered years before. The religious leaders of his day would eventually struggle to categorize him. These men who had spent their entire lives memorizing intricate details of scriptural law, but had somehow lost sight of the love that was supposed to flow through every commandment like life-giving water through parched ground. They inhabited a world where faith had become complicated and burdensome, layered with rules and regulations that often seemed designed to exclude rather than include, to burden rather than bless, to separate the supposedly worthy from the obviously unworthy, rather than revealing divine love that embraces all humanity without distinction or reservation. Jesus had grown up observing how ordinary people struggled under weights they were never meant to carry alone. watching how the light in their eyes dimmed when they felt disconnected from the divine love they longed to know and serve, witnessing how shoulders sagged beneath burdens that religious authorities kept adding rather than lifting. He saw how the simple desire to love their Creator and care for their neighbors had been buried beneath centuries of interpretation and debate, how the joy of spiritual relationship had been replaced by anxiety about ritual correctness, how the freedom that should characterize life with the divine had been exchanged for a nervous striving that could never find rest because it never found acceptance. Yet there was something in Jesus that remained undiminished by the spiritual darkness he observed around him, a light that seemed to grow brighter rather than dimmer when faced with the world's confusion and pain. In Joseph's workshop, he had learned that restoration was always possible, that what seemed ruined could be made beautiful again through the application of skill and patience and love. These lessons in the repair of broken things would become the foundation of everything he would later teach and demonstrate, living proof that no human heart is beyond the reach of divine grace, no life too damaged to be made whole, no situation too desperate to be transformed by love. The political atmosphere of his time was thick with tension and uncertainty that affected every aspect of daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. Roman soldiers marched through Jewish streets with the confident arrogance of occupying forces, their presence a constant reminder that this promised land was currently under foreign control, their demands for taxes and compliance leaving families struggling to maintain both their physical survival and their spiritual integrity. Revolutionary movements flickered and died like brief flames in strong wind, leaving behind only more suffering and tighter restrictions, more suspicion between neighbors, and less freedom for a people who remembered stories of independence and divine favor. Into this world of political oppression and religious confusion, Jesus would soon step with a message so simple it seemed naive to sophisticated minds, yet so radical it would turn the established order upside down. He would demonstrate that the kingdom of heaven advances not through violence or political maneuvering, not through religious debate or philosophical argument, but through the revolutionary power of unconditional love expressed in practical service to anyone who needed healing, hope, or simply the assurance that they mattered to someone who would never abandon them regardless of their past mistakes or present circumstances. But for now, he was simply Jesus of Nazareth, approaching the age when Jewish men traditionally began their public ministry, his heart already full of the love he would soon pour out for the healing of the world, but his public work still waiting for the proper time, the divine appointment that would launch those years of ministry, destined to change the course of human history forever. He walked the same dusty roads you are walking now in your imagination, breathed the same flower-scented air that you are breathing in this peaceful moment, looked up at the same star-filled sky under which you are now resting, carrying within his fully human heart mysteries that would soon be revealed to anyone whose heart was prepared to receive them. Chapter 4. The beginning of something sacred. The morning sun painted the sky in gentle watercolors of rose and gold as Jesus made his way through the rocky terrain toward the banks of the Jordan River, where crowds had been gathering for weeks to hear the powerful message of a desert prophet whose call to repentance had stirred hearts throughout the region and beyond. This was John, who had grown up in wilderness places sustained by locusts and wild honey, clothed in rough camel's hair, his entire being radiating the intensity of someone who had spent years learning to distinguish the voice of the divine from every other sound competing for human attention in a world full of distractions and false promises. John's voice carried across the flowing water with authority that came not from institutional credentials, but from direct encounter with divine truth, calling people to genuine transformation of heart and mind rather than mere external observance of religious customs that had lost their power to change lives. The crowds that came to him represented every level of Palestinian society, from wealthy merchants to desperate beggars, from learned scribes to simple farmers, all of them sensing that something unprecedented was stirring in the spiritual atmosphere of their time, something that demanded response deeper than intellectual curiosity or casual interest. Tax collectors who had grown comfortable with their collaboration with Roman authorities found themselves under conviction about choices that had enriched them financially while impoverishing them spiritually, their questions revealing hearts that had not been completely hardened by years of compromise and moral flexibility. Soldiers trained in violence and intimidation asked what they must do to live lives pleasing to their Creator, their weapons temporarily set aside as they contemplated the possibility that there might be different ways to find security and meaning than through the application of force and the cultivation of fear in others. Religious leaders arrived to investigate this new teacher, some with genuinely seeking hearts hungry for authentic spiritual renewal, others with suspicious minds already prepared to find fault with anyone whose message challenged their carefully maintained positions of authority and influence. Pharisees and Sadducees, who normally maintained careful distance from each other, found themselves standing side by side in the presence of someone whose call to repentance made no exceptions for religious credentials or social status, whose vision of divine judgment and mercy cut through human pretensions to address the condition of the heart alone. The baptism that John offered was far more than ritual washing, but a powerful symbol of death and rebirth, of old life being buried beneath the waters and new life emerging purified and renewed, ready for the kind of transformation that goes far deeper than external behavior, modification to touch the very core of human identity and purpose. Those who submitted to this baptism were acknowledging their need for cleansing they could not provide for themselves, confessing their hunger for righteousness they could not achieve through their own efforts, expressing their readiness to participate in divine purposes that transcended their individual understanding and ambition. Then one morning that began like so many others but would be remembered as long as human hearts beat with hope for redemption, Jesus appeared among the crowd, not as spectator observing religious phenomenon, but as someone seeking to identify completely with humanity's need for purification and renewal. When John saw him approaching through the gathered multitude, something in the Baptist spirit recognized immediately that this was the moment for which his entire ministry had been preparation, the arrival of the one whose coming he had been announcing with prophetic certainty, though he had never seen his face until this morning. John's initial protest revealed his intuitive understanding of the reversal taking place before his eyes, his recognition that in the presence of this particular candidate for baptism, roles should be reversed, that he was the one who needed what Jesus had to offer rather than the other way around. But Jesus insisted gently that this baptism was necessary to fulfill divine purposes, to complete the picture of his identification with human experience, to demonstrate that he had come not to stand apart from human need, but to enter fully into it, including the process of cleansing and consecration that prepares hearts for divine service. As Jesus descended into Jordan's flowing waters, the very atmosphere around the river seemed to shift and change, as if all creation held its breath in recognition that something unprecedented was occurring, something that would mark the beginning of ministry destined to transform not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human history. The water that had cleansed countless others now received the one who had no need of cleansing except for this moment of perfect identification with the humanity he had come to save. This demonstration of divine willingness to participate fully in human experience, including the longing for purification and new beginning. When Jesus emerged from the water, streaming with river flow but radiant with something far more significant than physical cleansing, The heavens opened in a way that several witnesses would later describe as more profound than any natural phenomenon they had ever observed. The Spirit descended upon him in the form of a dove, that ancient symbol of peace and new beginnings, settling upon his head with gentleness that spoke of divine approval and affection beyond human measurement or understanding. Then came the voice, audible to some though not to all, words that revealed the eternal relationship between Father and Son, while announcing to anyone with ears to hear that the long-awaited time had finally arrived. That promises made through centuries of prophetic hope were about to find their fulfillment in this carpenter from Nazareth, who had just submitted to baptism like any other penitent, despite his complete freedom from anything requiring forgiveness. The voice declared with authority that echoed across water and through centuries, and those words carried to every heart that has ever wondered about their own acceptance by divine love, their own standing before the throne of infinite grace. Chapter 5. Words that changed everything on a hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee, where wildflowers painted the grass in brilliant shades of purple and gold, and the morning air carried the fresh sweetness of water and growing things. Jesus sat down to teach the crowd that had been following him with increasing eagerness as word spread about this rabbi whose words carried power unlike anything they had ever heard before. The natural amphitheater of the hillside allowed his voice to reach everyone present without strain, while the beautiful setting of lake and mountains created an atmosphere of peace that prepared hearts to receive truths that would challenge everything they thought they knew about divine love and life and the meaning of human existence. The gathering that morning represented a cross-section of Palestinian society that would have been remarkable in any other context. Wealthy merchants sitting beside poor laborers, learned scribes mixed among illiterate farmers, mothers holding babies next to elderly men whose bent backs spoke of decades of hard work under unforgiving sun. What united them was not social status or educational background, but hunger they all recognized in each other's faces, longing for something their souls knew they needed, but their minds struggled to name or define. When Jesus began to speak, his words fell into the silence like seeds into prepared soil, each phrase carrying both immediate comfort and long-term challenge, each teaching overturning conventional wisdom while revealing deeper truths about the nature of divine love and human purpose. He did not speak in technical language of theological debate or elaborate rhetoric of political oratory, but in words so simple that children could understand them, yet so profound that the wisest sages would spend lifetimes exploring their depths. He began with declarations that turned the world's understanding of blessing upside down in the most wonderful way. In a culture that equated divine favor with material prosperity and spiritual blessing with earthly success, Jesus was proclaiming that those who recognized their spiritual poverty, their desperate need for something beyond their own resources, were the ones most positioned to receive the infinite wealth of divine love. The kingdom of heaven, he explained, belonged to them not despite their emptiness, but because of their readiness to be filled. He continued with words that washed over the crowd like balm on wounds, acknowledging that grief and mourning were not evidence of divine displeasure but invitation to experience comfort that could only come from the source of all consolation. Their tears were not wasted water but precious offerings, their sorrow not meaningless pain but preparation for joy beyond anything they could imagine. Their loss is not final defeats, but opportunities for divine love to demonstrate its power to heal and restore and make all things new. Each blessing he pronounced challenged assumptions of a world that celebrated strength while dismissing gentleness, that admired aggressive achievement while overlooking humble service, that rewarded those who grabbed what they wanted while ignoring those who waited patiently for blessing to find them. He spoke of meekness inheriting the earth, transforming gentleness from weakness into strength and humility from failure into the path to true greatness. The revolutionary nature of his teaching became even more apparent as he moved beyond blessing to practical instruction about living in ways that reflected divine rather than human values. He referenced legal principles that had governed human relationships for generations, but then introduced radical concepts about not resisting evil persons, about turning the other cheek when struck, about breaking endless cycles of retaliation that kept human communities trapped in patterns of escalating violence and ever-increasing hatred. When he commanded love for enemies and prayer for persecutors, the very air seemed to shimmer with the radical possibility he was presenting to anyone willing to consider living according to such extraordinary principles. This was not merely good advice for those feeling particularly charitable on a given day, but complete redefinition of what it meant to be human, called to embody the same kind of indiscriminate love that caused sun to shine on both righteous and unrighteous, rain to fall on both just and unjust, divine heart to extend mercy to all without regard for worthiness or desert. As the day progressed and Jesus continued teaching, using stories drawn from everyday experiences that revealed profound spiritual truths about divine love and human responsibility, people listening began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their experience of religious instruction. This was not just another teacher offering slightly different interpretations of familiar ideas, but someone who spoke as if he had direct access to the heart of ultimate reality, who revealed truths about divine character and intentions that rang with unmistakable clarity of absolute authenticity. His teachings about prayer transformed what had become for many a duty performed out of obligation into conversation, conducted in confidence of being heard and cherished by Heavenly Parent whose love exceeded any earthly parent's care by infinite measure. The prayer he taught them was both simple enough for children to memorize and profound enough to sustain adult hearts through every joy and sorrow life could present, covering every essential human need from daily provision to eternal forgiveness, from protection against temptation to deliverance from evil. When Jesus spoke about worry and anxiety, addressing concerns that troubled every heart in his audience, regardless of their economic status or social position, his words carried authority of someone who had never allowed fear to separate him from trust in divine provision. He pointed to birds of the air who do not sow or reap or store away in barns, yet are fed by heavenly care, asking if human beings were not much more valuable than they, challenging assumptions about security that drove so much human anxiety and competitive striving. His teaching about judging others revealed both divine mercy and human responsibility in perfect balance, showing how forgiveness and accountability could coexist without contradiction in hearts that had learned to see themselves and others through lens of divine love rather than human prejudice. His warning against judgment was not permission for moral relativism or spiritual indifference, but recognition that the same mercy we need for our own failures must be extended to others in their struggles, that the same grace we hope to receive must be offered freely to anyone whose heart is open to receive it. Chapter 6. Miracles of Compassion as Word of Jesus is Extraordinary. Teaching spread like ripples across the still surface of Galilee's social landscape, reaching into villages and towns where stories of restoration and hope traveled faster than any official messenger could carry news. Something else began happening that amazed everyone who witnessed it. The same love and power that flowed through his words began manifesting itself in miraculous healings and supernatural demonstrations of compassion. But these were not theatrical displays designed to impress crowds or validate credentials, but spontaneous responses to human need, revealing the very heart of divine love toward every form of suffering and brokenness, marring the beauty of creation. In the bustling fishing village of Capernaum, where morning air carried scent of nets drying in sun and sound of boats being prepared for another day's work on the sea. A Roman centurion's beloved servant lay dying, consumed by fever and paralysis that had resisted every treatment the most skilled physicians could provide. This military officer, though representing occupying forces that many Jews considered their enemies, had earned genuine respect throughout the community through his fairness and obvious care for Jewish people under his authority, even funding construction of their local synagogue with his own resources. When the centurion heard that Jesus was approaching the town, something in his heart recognized that this teacher from Nazareth possessed authority of completely different kind than any earthly power he had known in his years of military service. His faith was so profound, and his understanding of spiritual authority so clear, that he sent word to Jesus saying there was no need for him to actually visit the house where the servant lay dying, declaring that he need only speak the word and healing would occur. The faith demonstrated by this Gentile soldier amazed even Jesus, who declared to Jewish crowds following him that he had not found such trust anywhere in Israel. The man understood something about divine authority that escaped many who had been raised in traditions of faith, recognizing that Jesus' power was not limited by physical presence or geographical distance, but operated according to principles that transcended ordinary human experience. And indeed, at the very moment Jesus spoke words of healing from miles away, the centurion's servant opened his eyes, sat up in his bed, and asked for something to eat, his fever completely gone and his strength fully restored. On another day, as Jesus was teaching beside the shore, where fishing boats bobbed gently in shallow water and children played in sand while their mothers listened to his words, a woman who had suffered from hemorrhaging for 12 long years pressed through the crowd that surrounded him. She had spent everything she owned on physicians who had only made her condition worse, and according to religious laws of her culture, her ailment made her ceremonially unclean, cutting her off from normal social interaction and preventing her from participating in worship and community life that gave meaning to existence. She had lived for over a decade as exile in her own town, watching life go by from margins, growing weaker physically while her hope gradually dwindled to faintest flicker. But she had heard about Jesus, about his compassion for outcasts and sinners, about his willingness to touch untouchable and welcome unwelcome, about way he seemed to see past external circumstances to hearts that beat beneath. Her faith was desperate but certain, born from kind of hope that emerges only when every other option has been exhausted, yet something in soul refuses to surrender completely. As she reached out trembling fingers to barely graze the hem of his garment as he passed by, power flowed from Jesus like lightning, and immediately she felt the bleeding stop, felt strength returning to body that had been drained by years of illness, felt shame and isolation that had defined her existence lifted away like burden she had carried so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Jesus, sensing that healing power had gone out from him, stopped walking and turned to crowd with question, born not of irritation but of desire to complete what had begun with physical healing by adding blessing of personal recognition and restored dignity. When the woman came forward, terrified yet compelled by his kindness, expecting rebuke, but receiving instead words that transformed her understanding of her own worth, Jesus looked at her with infinite tenderness and spoke recognition that welcomed her back into human family, restored her to rightful place in community of beloved children, given identity that no illness could steal and no law could revoke. The healing that began with stopping of her bleeding was completed with restoration of her dignity, renewal of her hope, return of her proper standing among those who belonged to household of faith. The miracles multiplied day after day, each one revealing not just divine power, but divine heart, not just ability to suspend natural laws, but passionate desire to enter into human suffering and transform it into testimony of love's triumph over every force that would diminish or destroy beautiful creatures made in divine image. Lepers whose disease had made them living symbols of decay and death found their flesh restored to purity of childhood, their skin glowing with health they had not known in years, their voices freed to speak words of gratitude after years of having to cry warnings to keep others away from their contaminating presence. When Jesus encountered funeral procession leaving town of Nain, carrying body of young man whose death had left his mother not only grieving but economically devastated, since she was now widow without male relatives to provide for her care, his compassion was so moved that he could not simply walk past without acting. Death had seemed to have final word in this woman's story, taking first her husband and now her only son, leaving her facing future of poverty and dependence on whatever charity her community might provide. But Jesus touched stretcher carrying young man's body, and with same authority he had used to command storms to be still and seas to be calm, he spoke directly to one who lay silent and motionless beneath burial cloths, calling him back to life with power that made death itself obedient to love's command. The effect was immediate and astounding as life returned to body that had been cold and still, as breath filled lungs that had ceased their function, as young man sat up and began to speak, fully restored not just to biological function, but to completeness of human existence, with all its potential for joy and love and meaningful participation in ongoing story of his family and community. Chapter 7. Walking among the people, what distinguished Jesus' ministry from every other religious movement of his time was not merely the power of his teachings or the wonder of his miracles, though both were extraordinary beyond anything his contemporaries had ever witnessed. The truly revolutionary aspect of his approach was the way he moved through the world, the people he chose to spend time with, and the barriers he consistently crossed with such natural grace that observers were left breathless by the casual way he dismantled centuries of social convention and religious tradition simply by treating every person as if they possessed infinite worth in eyes of divine love. In bustling marketplaces of Galilee, where merchants called out their wares under colorful awnings and air filled with sounds of bargaining and conversation, where children darted between stalls and women carried water jars with practiced grace, Jesus walked with relaxed familiarity of someone completely comfortable among ordinary people living ordinary lives. Unlike religious leaders who maintained careful distance from anyone whose contact might compromise their ritual purity or social standing, Jesus seemed to genuinely enjoy company of tax collectors and fishermen, former prostitutes and reformed sinners, anyone whose heart remained open to possibility of transformation through divine love. He would pause at Potter's workshop, examining vessels taking shape under skilled hands and asking questions that revealed his genuine interest in craft while using answers as natural illustrations for deeper truths about divine craftsman who shapes human hearts with infinite patience and wisdom. At Baker's stall, he would breathe in warm fragrance of fresh bread and speak about spiritual nourishment that could satisfy hungers no earthly food could touch, his words transforming everyday experiences into windows through which listeners could glimpse eternal realities. Children seemed especially drawn to Jesus, sensing in him kind of adult who would listen to their questions without condescension, who would enter into their games without embarrassment, who would take seriously their concerns and dreams and fears in ways that made them feel valued and heard. When his disciples attempted to discourage such interruptions, thinking their master's time was too valuable to be spent on those who could contribute nothing to his mission, Jesus' response revealed the heart of his entire ministry, declaring that the kingdom of heaven belonged to such as these, that their unguarded trust and capacity for wonder provided perfect illustrations of faith that opens hearts to receive divine love without reservation or calculation. He would sit on ground with them, his teaching robes gathering dust as he listened to their excited chatter about treasures they had found or adventures they had imagined, entering into their world with such genuine delight that they forgot he was anyone other than friend, who cared about what mattered to them. In their willingness to believe good things about people they had just met, Jesus found living demonstrations of trust that allows divine grace to work without hindrance from cynicism or sophisticated skepticism that often prevents adults from receiving simple gifts offered with pure hearts. When Samaritan woman approached Jacob's well during noon heat, timing her visit to avoid other women who normally gathered there in cooler morning hours, she expected to draw her water in solitude and return home without encountering anyone who might remind her of shame and disappointment that had marked her recent years. The last thing she anticipated was finding Jewish rabbi sitting beside well, and she certainly never imagined that he would speak to her, let alone ask her for a drink of water, in violation of every social convention governing interactions between Jews and Samaritans, men and women, religious teachers and social outcasts. The conversation that unfolded revealed both Jesus' supernatural knowledge of her personal history and his profound compassion for loneliness and searching that had driven her from one relationship to another in futile attempt to find someone who could satisfy deep thirst of her heart for love that would never disappoint or abandon her. Instead of condemnation she expected from religious teacher, he offered her living water, kind that would spring up from within her own soul and become source of satisfaction that no earthly relationship could provide or destroy. By time their conversation ended, this woman who had come to well burdened with secrets and sorrow left her water jar behind and ran back to very town, where she had been living as something of outcast. So excited about her encounter with Jesus that she could not contain the news. Her transformation was so evident, her joy so authentic, that many Samaritans came to believe in Jesus simply because of her testimony, proving that divine love recognizes no boundaries of ethnicity or gender or social standing. In Jerusalem, during one of great religious festivals when city overflowed with pilgrims from throughout Jewish world, Jesus encountered man who had been disabled for 38 years, lying beside pool of Bethesda among crowd of other sick and disabled people, who believed that healing waters would occasionally stir and provide restoration for whoever could enter pool first. This man had given up hope decades earlier, resigned to life defined by limitation and dependency, watching others find healing that seemed forever beyond his reach. When Jesus asked if he wanted to get well, question that might have seemed obvious actually penetrated to heart of what it means to choose hope over despair, to risk disappointment by believing that change remains possible even after decades of evidence suggesting otherwise. When man explained his predicament, how he had no one to help him into pool when waters were stirred, how he was always too slow to reach healing before others claimed it, Jesus didn't offer to assist him with traditional method, but spoke with simple authority that transformed everything in single moment of divine grace. Immediately man was cured. Muscles that had been atrophied for nearly 4 decades, suddenly strong and responsive. Limbs that had been useless suddenly capable of carrying him wherever he desired to go. He picked up mat that had been both bed and symbol of his helplessness for so many years, and he walked, not hesitantly or with uncertainty, but with confident stride of someone whose body had never known limitation. The healing was complete, instantaneous, and utterly transformative, restoring not just physical function, but dignity and purpose and hope of future worth living. Chapter 8. Fellow seekers of peace, as we pause here together in our sacred journey, my dear companion on this path of peace, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something beautiful that has been happening in quiet spaces of your heart, as we have walked together through these ancient stories. Breathed same holy air that surrounded Jesus as he moved among people of his time, and witnessed same revolutionary love in action that continues to transform hearts in our own day, including yours as you rest here in gentle embrace of this peaceful evening. You are not alone in this experience of encountering divine love through these timeless narratives. All around our world tonight, other souls exactly like yours have found their way to the same sanctuary of rest. Other weary hearts seeking same comfort you are discovering. Other searching spirits drawn by same longing for peace that brought you to this quiet place, where modern urgency gives way to ancient wisdom and contemporary anxiety dissolves in presence of eternal love that knows your name and cherishes every detail of your unique story. There is something profoundly moving about this invisible community of seekers that has formed around these sacred stories, this fellowship of hearts that spans continents and cultures, united not by geography or background, but by shared recognition that our souls were made for more than endless cycle of stress and striving that characterizes so much of modern existence. Some who join us tonight are longtime pilgrims who have discovered that these quiet encounters with Jesus bring special quality of rest that cannot be found anywhere else in our hurried world. Others are newer to this kind of spiritual exploration, their hearts cautiously opening to possibilities they may have dismissed before, drawn by hungers they can barely name but cannot ignore. Whether you have been walking this contemplative path for years, or whether tonight marks your first tentative step into this realm of sacred rest, you belong here completely, exactly as you are, with all your questions and doubts intact, with all your hopes and fears acknowledged, with all your past mistakes forgiven and your future possibilities embraced by love that sees not what you have been, but what you are becoming through divine grace, working patiently in depths of your being. If these stories of Jesus' compassion have stirred something beautiful in your spirit tonight, if his interactions with outcasts and sinners have awakened hope in places of your heart that had grown accustomed to disappointment, if his gentle treatment of children and his patient love for confused disciples has helped, you believe that you too might be worthy of such tender acceptance, then I want to invite you to consider becoming part of our growing family of fellow seekers who have discovered that spiritual rest is not luxury but necessity, that these quiet moments of encounter with divine love are not optional additions to life, but essential nourishment for souls that were created for relationship with their Creator. By subscribing to our journey together, you are not merely accessing additional content, though there will certainly be more sacred stories to explore, more ancient wisdom to discover, more pathways to kind of peace that restores weary hearts and heals wounded spirits. You are joining community of people who understand that slowing down is actually speeding up toward what matters most, that choosing contemplation over constant activity is choosing wisdom over foolishness, that some truths can only be received when we create space for them to settle into hearts that have learned to be still in presence of divine love. Your presence in this community matters more than you might realize, dear friend. When you choose to walk with us through these sacred narratives, when you allow your heart to be touched by same love that transformed fishermen into apostles and tax collectors into evangelists, you are participating in something that transcends individual experience and becomes part of eternal story of divine love pursuing human hearts across every barrier of time and culture and circumstance. Your openness to receive this love creates ripples that bless not only your own life, but lives of everyone whose path intersects with yours in days and weeks ahead. Please know that your thoughts and reflections, your own experiences of encountering Jesus through these stories, are deeply valued and welcomed in comment section below each of these peaceful narratives. This is sacred space where hearts can share honestly about their spiritual journeys, where questions can be asked without fear of judgment, where testimonies of grace can encourage others who may be struggling with doubt or disappointment, or simple weariness that comes from trying to navigate life's challenges without adequate spiritual resources. Sometimes people hesitate to engage with spiritual content online, wondering if their faith is strong enough, or their understanding deep enough, or their questions appropriate enough to contribute to conversations about divine love and eternal truth. But remember, disciples, we have been observing in these stories ordinary men with extraordinary flaws. People who asked obvious questions and made embarrassing mistakes, yet were loved completely by Jesus and entrusted with most important message in human history. Your questions matter because they reveal heart that is seeking, and seeking hearts are exactly what divine love delights to find and satisfy. Your struggles matter because they connect you to every other person who has ever wrestled with doubt or disappointment. And sharing your struggles gives others permission to acknowledge their own need for grace and healing. Your discoveries matter because they testify to reality of divine love working in contemporary hearts, proving that Jesus we encounter in these ancient stories continues to transform lives in our modern world. In weeks and months ahead, we will continue exploring stories that have power to heal wounded hearts and restore hope to discouraged spirits. We will journey together through experiences of saints and mystics who found divine presence in desert solitudes and mountain retreats, discovering how their encounters with divine love can illuminate our own spiritual paths. We will meditate on ancient prayers and psalms that have sustained seekers through persecution and plague, through seasons of abundance and times of desperate need, always finding in them fresh resources for contemporary challenges. We will visit gentle wisdom of Francis of Assisi, who learned to see Christ in every created thing and to hear divine love, speaking through songs of birds and whisper of wind through trees. We will explore mystical revelations of Julian of Norwich, whose visions of divine love sustained her through some of darkest periods in human history, while revealing truths about divine heart that continue to comfort hearts today. We will discover how contemplatives across cultures and centuries have found pathways to peace that remain available to anyone willing to walk them with sincere hearts and open minds. Chapter 9. The 12 and Their Stories. As word of Jesus' teaching and healing spread like ripples across still surface of Galilee's social landscape, reaching into villages and towns where stories of restoration and hope traveled faster than any Roman messenger could carry official news, Jesus recognized growing need for companions who could share not only in his daily ministry, but in his deeper mission of demonstrating divine love to a world that had almost forgotten what such love looked like. In practical human terms, from among larger group of followers who had begun to gather wherever he went, he chose 12 men to serve as his apostles, his sent ones, who would eventually carry his message to ends of earth. These 12 were not kind of men religious establishments typically selected for positions of spiritual authority, not polished scholars who had mastered intricacies of scriptural interpretation, not socially prominent figures whose endorsement might lend credibility to new movement, but ordinary working men whose hearts remained tender enough to recognize divine love when it called their names and invited them into adventure beyond anything their limited imaginations could have conceived. Their selection revealed Jesus' consistent preference for potential over pedigree, for willingness over worthiness, for hearts ready to be transformed, rather than minds already convinced of their own completeness. Simon, whom Jesus renamed Peter, brought to group passionate intensity of natural leader, whose enthusiasm often exceeded his wisdom, but whose love for his master ran deeper than sea from which he had drawn his living for so many years. Peter possessed kind of personality that spoke first and thought later, that acted on impulse rather than reflection, that promised more than human strength could deliver, yet somehow always found reserves of grace sufficient for whatever challenges divine love placed before him. His journey from fisherman to fisher of men would take him through depths of failure and heights of faithfulness that would demonstrate how completely divine love could transform even most unstable human foundations. Andrew, Peter's brother, brought quieter but equally devoted heart to their fellowship. Kind of person who preferred to work behind scenes rather than in spotlight, whose greatest joy came from introducing others to teacher who had changed his life. Andrew possessed gift of seeing potential in unlikely people and creating opportunities for them to encounter Jesus personally. Beginning with his own brother and continuing throughout their years, together with consistent ministry of connection that built bridges between seeking hearts and love they were seeking. James and John, sons of Zebedee, carried nicknames that revealed their fiery temperaments and quick tempers, earning titles Sons of Thunder, who were always ready to call down divine judgment on anyone who failed to properly honor their beloved master. Their passionate natures served them well in some situations, but required constant redirection from destructive impulses toward constructive expression of their zeal for divine truth and justice. Under Jesus' patient influence, their capacity for righteous anger would be transformed into equally passionate love, their readiness for conflict channeled into courage for service that would eventually cost them everything they had to give. Philip approached discipleship with careful, analytical mind of someone who liked to understand things thoroughly before committing himself completely, whose practical nature sometimes struggled with supernatural dimensions of following Jesus, but whose intellectual honesty kept him asking questions until he found satisfactory answers. When Jesus tested Philip's faith by asking how they could feed a crowd of 5,000 people, Philip immediately began calculating costs and logistics, his systematic mind unable to conceive of solutions that transcended ordinary human resources and conventional approaches to seemingly impossible problems. Nathanael, also called Bartholomew, initially approached Jesus with skepticism of someone whose knowledge of geography and prophecy made him doubt that anything significant could emerge from village as insignificant as Nazareth. His honest questions revealed not cynicism but genuine desire to understand, not rejection of divine truth but careful evaluation of claims that seemed too wonderful to believe without adequate evidence. When Jesus demonstrated supernatural knowledge of his character and activities, Nathanael's skepticism dissolved into worship that was all more profound because it had been preceded by honest doubt rather than uncritical acceptance. Matthew brought to their group unique perspective of someone who had collaborated with Roman authorities for personal profit, who understood corruption of occupying power from inside its system, who knew what it meant to be despised by his own people for choices that had enriched him financially while impoverishing him spiritually and socially. His transformation from tax collector to apostle became living proof that no past was too shameful, no reputation too damaged, no heart too hardened to be reached by divine love and restored to usefulness in kingdom of heaven. Thomas, forever remembered primarily for his post-resurrection doubts rather than his pre-crucifixion courage, actually demonstrated tremendous loyalty and bravery throughout his years with Jesus, volunteering to accompany his master back into dangerous territory where religious authorities had threatened his life. His questions and uncertainties arose not from lack of love, but from desire to understand completely, to have solid foundations for faith that could withstand testing and persecution and inevitable challenges that would come to anyone who chose to follow Jesus in a world often hostile to divine love. Simon the Zealot represented yet another background entirely, bringing to their fellowship perspective of someone who had been involved with political resistance movement that sought to overthrow Roman occupation through force and revolutionary violence. His presence among 12, alongside Matthew, who had collaborated with very forces Simon had opposed, demonstrated Jesus' ability to unite people whose natural inclinations would have made them enemies, creating unity not through compromise of convictions, but through shared devotion to love that transcended political divisions and personal prejudices. Living in daily contact with these 11 very different personalities, Jesus demonstrated what it meant to love people, not because they were perfect, but because love itself is perfect. Not because they deserved affection, but because divine affection flows toward human hearts regardless of their worthiness or readiness to receive it properly. He saw through Peter's impulsive bluster to his genuine devotion, appreciated Andrew's humble service even when it received little public recognition, channeled Sons of Thunder's passionate energy toward constructive purposes rather than destructive expressions. The disciples observed Jesus handling every conceivable situation with wisdom and grace that never seemed forced or artificial, but flowed naturally from his perfect understanding of human nature and divine purpose. They watched him respond to hostile questions without losing patience or compromising truth, witnessed his interactions with women and children and outcasts that revealed divine love's consistency regardless of social status or cultural expectations. Notice that his private character matched his public teachings in ways that gave absolute credibility to everything he claimed about divine heart toward humanity. Chapter 10. Opposition and Persecution. As Jesus' influence expanded throughout Palestine and his message of radical love reached deeper into hearts that had been hardened by disappointment and religious legalism, established authorities began to recognize him, not as welcome spiritual teacher, but as fundamental threat to carefully constructed systems through which they maintained their power, their prestige, and their comfortable arrangements with both religious tradition and political reality. What started as curiosity and skepticism gradually hardened into active opposition, and eventually into kind of murderous hostility that reveals how threatening divine love can be to hearts that have chosen darkness over light, control over surrender, fear over faith. The Pharisees, who had built their entire identity around meticulous observance of religious law and careful attention to ritual requirements that distinguished them from common people they considered less spiritually disciplined, found themselves increasingly disturbed by Jesus' apparent disregard for traditions they held sacred. When his disciples picked grain on Sabbath to satisfy their hunger, when he healed sick people on day designated for rest, when he ate meals with tax collectors and sinners without ensuring proper ceremonial cleansing had taken place, he was challenging not just their practices but their fundamental understanding of what it meant to honor divine will and live according to divine commands. Their objections to Jesus' behavior were not merely petty criticisms of minor infractions but expressions of genuine concern about what they perceived as dangerous departures from scriptural authority and ancestral wisdom. They had spent their lives learning to navigate complex requirements of religious law, creating elaborate systems designed to help people avoid accidentally breaking divine commandments, building careful fences around biblical precepts to ensure no one could inadvertently step outside boundaries of acceptable behavior. Jesus' casual attitude toward their protective regulations seemed to them like carelessness at best and blasphemy at worst. Jesus' responses to their criticisms revealed heart issues behind their theological objections, exposing how easily religious devotion could become religious pride, how quickly concern for divine honor could transform into concern for personal reputation, how subtly desire to serve could be corrupted into desire to be recognized as especially godly by others, whose approval had become more important than divine approval. When he told them that Sabbath was made for humanity rather than humanity for Sabbath, He was turning their understanding of divine purpose upside down in ways that challenged everything they had been taught about proper priorities and spiritual values. The Sadducees, who controlled temple and its lucrative operations while maintaining careful political relationships with Roman authorities, saw Jesus' threat to delicate balance they had achieved between religious autonomy and imperial oversight. They didn't share Pharisees' concern about ceremonial purity or detailed law observance, but they were deeply worried about anyone whose growing popularity might attract unwanted attention from Roman governors who had little patience for Jewish religious movements that could be interpreted as politically subversive or socially destabilizing. Their opposition to Jesus was primarily practical rather than theological, motivated more by concern for institutional preservation than by doctrinal disagreement. They understood that Roman rule depended on local cooperation and that any disruption in peaceful administration of their territory could result in harsh crackdowns that would destroy their privileged position and potentially bring disaster to their entire nation. Jesus' miracle-working power and crowd-drawing charisma represented exactly kind of phenomenon that could be misinterpreted by suspicious imperial administrators as dangerous to Roman interests. The scribes and teachers of religious law, whose authority rested on their expertise in interpreting ancient texts and applying scriptural principles to contemporary situations, found themselves intellectually threatened by someone who taught with direct authority rather than citing other authorities to support his positions. Jesus didn't need to reference earlier rabbis or quote established commentaries to validate his teachings because he spoke with immediacy of personal knowledge, revealing divine truth with clarity that made their elaborate, scholarly debates seem irrelevant and their careful academic distinctions appear insignificant. Their professional identity was built on being recognized experts in matters of religious law and spiritual interpretation, ones to whom ordinary people looked for guidance about proper belief and acceptable behavior. Jesus' ability to teach profound truths in simple language that connected directly with human hearts bypassed their mediating function, making their specialized knowledge seem unnecessary and their authority appear questionable in ways that threatened both their livelihood and their sense of purpose. The opposition intensified as religious leaders began testing Jesus with carefully crafted questions designed to trap him in contradictions or force him to make statements that could be used against him either in religious courts or before Roman tribunals. They asked about paying taxes to Caesar, hoping to make him choose between alienating Jewish patriots who resented foreign taxation and giving them grounds to accuse him of sedition against imperial authority. They brought cases like woman caught in adultery, demanding judgments that would require him to choose between mercy and justice, between compassion and legal compliance. Time after time, Jesus' responses demonstrated wisdom that transcended human cleverness, revealing divine understanding that could satisfy deepest requirements of both justice and mercy, both truth and love, both respect for authority and compassion for human weakness. His answer about rendering to Caesar what belonged to Caesar while rendering to divine what belonged to divine acknowledged legitimate governmental authority while maintaining primacy of divine claims on human hearts. His response to adultery case invited anyone without sin to cast first stone, then offered woman both forgiveness and challenge to transformation. When intellectual challenges failed to discredit Jesus publicly, some religious leaders resorted to more desperate measures, suggesting that he performed his miracles through demonic power rather than divine authority, accusing him of being in league with forces of evil rather than agents of divine love. This blasphemous accusation revealed depths of spiritual blindness that opposition to divine truth could create, showing how hearts determined to reject divine love could eventually lose their ability to distinguish between good and evil, between light and darkness, between divine grace and satanic deception. Jesus' response to this ultimate accusation was both patient and stern, explaining that Satan could not cast out Satan because divided kingdoms could not stand, while warning about spiritual danger of attributing obvious works of divine spirit to evil sources. This wasn't divine vindictiveness but spiritual reality, recognition that people who consistently chose to call good evil and light darkness were in danger of destroying their own capacity for moral discernment and spiritual perception. Chapter 11. The final journey to Jerusalem. Time had come for Jesus to set his face steadfastly toward Jerusalem, and everyone who knew him could sense shift in his demeanor as he prepared for what he understood with divine clarity would be his final journey to Holy City, where prophets had always come to die and where ultimate demonstration of divine love would soon unfold before a world that desperately needed to witness such complete self-sacrifice for sake of human redemption. The relaxed pace of his Galilean ministry was drawing to close as he gathered his disciples for pilgrimage that would transform everything they thought they knew about divine power and human salvation. His closest followers recognized that something had changed in their master's attitude and approach, though they struggled to understand the nature of transformation they were witnessing. There was new intensity in his prayers, deeper urgency in his teaching, quality of purposeful determination that seemed to pull him toward Jerusalem despite obvious dangers that awaited him there. Religious authorities had already made their hostility clear. Political climate was charged with tension that could explode into violence at any moment. Yet Jesus moved toward center of this danger with steady resolve of someone who knew exactly what he was walking into, and why such apparent foolishness was actually wisest course of action possible. The disciples followed with growing uneasiness, their excitement about accompanying their master to Holy City during Passover season, mixed with increasing anxiety about what such journey might cost them all. Some walked close behind Jesus, trying to catch fragments of his prayers as he communed with his Father about mission that was reaching its climactic moment, their hearts troubled by words they occasionally overheard about suffering and death that made no sense in context of kingdom they had been expecting him to establish through demonstrations of irresistible power. Others hung back in group, whispering among themselves about wisdom of this journey, wondering whether following Jesus to Jerusalem might be a final mistake that would cost them everything they held dear, including their lives and futures and families who depended on them for support and protection. Crowds that had celebrated his miracles in Galilee might not be so welcoming in Judea, where religious opposition was more organized and political sensitivity was heightened by proximity to Roman administrative centers. Word of Jesus' approach spread ahead of them like wildfire, reaching villages and towns along their route where people came out to see this teacher, whose reputation had traveled throughout Palestine and beyond, some seeking healing for themselves or their loved ones. Others simply curious about man who had become subject of so much discussion and debate. Many joined growing procession, sensing that they were witnessing something historic, participating in events that would be remembered and recounted for generations to come. Among those who joined their journey were people whose lives had been transformed by Jesus' ministry over previous years, former outcasts who had been welcomed into his fellowship, healed individuals whose restoration had become permanent testimony to divine power, families whose children had been blessed by his touch, and whose hearts had been changed by his teachings about divine love. Their presence turned journey into kind of living parade of grace, mobile demonstration of what happened when divine love encountered human need with practical compassion. But there were also those who followed with darker intentions, agents sent by religious authorities to monitor Jesus' activities and report back on his movements. Roman officials concerned about any gathering that might become politically disruptive. Curiosity seekers whose interest was more entertainment than transformation. Atmosphere surrounding procession was charged with competing expectations and conflicting purposes that created tension even in midst of celebration. As they approached Jerusalem, Jesus made arrangements to visit Bethany, small village where his close friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus had welcomed him many times before, providing place of refuge and authentic fellowship that offered respite from demands of public ministry. But this visit would involve more than rest and refreshment, becoming instead stage for most dramatic miracle of his entire ministry, raising of Lazarus from dead after 4 days in tomb. When Jesus finally arrived in Bethany, he found household in mourning, with Martha and Mary grieving loss of their beloved brother and wondering why Jesus had not come sooner, why he had allowed someone he loved to die when his presence could have prevented such tragedy. Their questions revealed kind of honest wrestling with divine purposes that characterizes authentic faith, struggle to understand how divine love can coexist with human suffering, how divine power can permit losses that seem preventable and unnecessary. Jesus' response to their grief was not philosophical explanation, but practical demonstration. Not theological discourse about mysteries of divine will, but immediate action that revealed divine heart in ways no amount of teaching could accomplish. Standing before Lazarus' tomb, he commanded that stone be rolled away, despite Martha's protests about condition of body that had been dead for 4 days. Then, in voice that carried authority of divine life over death itself, he called forth life from death with power that made grave itself obedient to love's command. The miracle that followed sent shockwaves throughout region and beyond, as Lazarus emerged from tomb still wrapped in burial cloths, very much alive and completely restored to fullness of human existence. For many witnesses, this unprecedented demonstration of power over death itself confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt that Jesus was indeed Son of Divine Love, Messiah they had been waiting for, one who possessed authority over life and death in ways that belonged only to divine nature. But for religious authorities, this miracle represented final threat that could not be tolerated, definitive proof that Jesus must be eliminated before his influence became so great that it would be impossible to contain. Chief priests and Pharisees convened emergency meetings to discuss how they might arrest him without causing kind of public disturbance that could lead to Roman intervention and potential disaster for their entire nation. Their concern was as much political as theological, recognizing that Jesus' growing popularity could be interpreted by suspicious imperial administrators as dangerous to Roman interests. Chapter 12. The Last Supper and Betrayal. An upper room that had been carefully prepared according to Jesus' specific instructions. As shadows lengthened over Jerusalem and golden light of oil lamps began to flicker against stone walls that would witness most intimate and heartbreaking scene in human history. Jesus gathered with his 12 chosen companions for what he knew would be their final meal together, before everything they had shared for years would be shattered by betrayal, suffering, and apparent defeat that would test their faith beyond anything they could imagine enduring. The Passover celebration that spread before them carried accumulated weight of centuries of tradition, each ritual element connecting them to their ancestors' experience of divine deliverance from slavery in Egypt, each prayer and symbolic food reminding them of divine faithfulness to covenant people throughout their long history of wandering and waiting for ultimate redemption. Tonight, these ancient symbols would be invested with entirely new meaning as Jesus transformed this memorial of past deliverance into foundation of future salvation. As they reclined around low table in posture traditional for festive meals, sharing intimate fellowship that had sustained them through years of ministry together, there was atmosphere of both celebration and underlying tension that none of them could quite identify or explain. Jesus seemed simultaneously peaceful and deeply moved, speaking with intensity that suggested these words carried eternal significance while also displaying tenderness that revealed his infinite love for these imperfect men who had walked with him through miracles and controversies, triumphs and disappointments. Before they began formal meal, Jesus did something that shocked them all into stunned silence, something so unexpected and inappropriate by social standards that they struggled to process what they were witnessing. He rose from his place at table, removed his outer garments, wrapped towel around his waist, and began to wash their feet like most menial servant in household, performing work that even slaves often tried to avoid, because it placed them in such position of humiliation. Peter's protest was immediate and vehement, his voice expressing what they all felt about impropriety of their master kneeling before them with basin and towel, serving them in ways that reversed every normal understanding of authority and respect. When Jesus explained that Peter didn't understand now, but would understand later, Peter's response was characteristically absolute, refusing to allow such reversal of roles until Jesus explained deeper significance of what was happening. Spiritual truth being enacted through this physical demonstration of service and love. When Jesus finished washing their feet and returned to his place at table, he made lesson explicit while demonstrating through actions principles he had been teaching through words. He had set them example that they should do as he had done for them, showing that true leadership expresses itself through service rather than domination, that greatest among them would be one who serves rather than one who is served, that love demonstrates itself through humble acts of care rather than impressive displays of power or authority. As they began sharing Passover meal with its traditional elements and familiar prayers, Jesus took unleavened bread that commemorated their ancestors' hasty departure from Egypt and invested it with meaning that would echo through eternity. He broke bread and distributed it among them, explaining that it represented his body given for them, transforming simple act of sharing food into profound symbol of divine love, poured out completely for human redemption. Asking them to remember him whenever they repeated this sacred meal. Similarly, cup of wine that traditionally represented joy and divine blessing became symbol of new covenant, sealed not with blood of sacrificial animals, but with Jesus' own life poured out for salvation of humanity. As they shared wine, he explained that it represented new covenant in his blood, poured out for them and for many for forgiveness of sins that separate human hearts from divine love, establishing new relationship between heaven and earth that would make possible intimate fellowship that sin had destroyed. But then atmosphere and room shifted dramatically as Jesus made announcement that sent shockwaves through their intimate fellowship, words that fell like stones into peaceful atmosphere of their gathering, creating ripples of confusion and distress that reached every heart around table. One of them would betray him, he declared, and they began asking one by one whether surely he didn't mean them, their voices revealing genuine bewilderment at possibility that anyone among their number could be capable of such treachery. Jesus didn't immediately identify betrayer, but he gave sign that revealed his supernatural knowledge of human hearts and divine plan, indicating that one who dipped bread into bowl with him would be the one. When Judas Iscariot dipped his bread, Jesus spoke to him quietly but audibly, telling him to do quickly what he was about to do. Other disciples didn't understand what was happening, some assuming Jesus was sending Judas on errand related to their meal or their ministry to poor, having no idea they were witnessing moment when one of their own made his final choice between love and silver. After Judas departed into darkness that seemed to symbolize spiritual condition of his heart, Jesus spoke more openly with his remaining disciples about what was coming, trying to prepare them for separation. They couldn't imagine surviving in loss they couldn't believe was possible. He told them that he would be with them only little longer, that where he was going, they could not immediately follow, though they would join him eventually in ways they could not yet understand. Chapter 13. The Cross and the Crown from Peaceful Intimacy of Upper Room, where love had been demonstrated through service and covenant, had been established through shared bread and wine. Jesus led his disciples through sleeping streets of Jerusalem toward a garden called Gethsemane, place of ancient olive trees where he had often retreated for prayer and communion with his Father, but which tonight would become arena for most intense spiritual battle ever fought on earth. Struggle between divine will and human nature, between love's determination to save and natural recoil from suffering required to accomplish such salvation, through means that would appear to many like defeat rather than victory. The garden that had been sanctuary of peace during their previous visits felt different this night, charged with atmosphere of impending crisis that even disciples could sense despite their incomplete understanding of what was approaching. Jesus' demeanor had changed from tender intimacy of their meal together to something heavier, more burdened, revealing weight of divine mission as it reached its climactic moment when all accumulated sin and suffering of humanity would be concentrated into one terrible experience of separation from Father's love. He told Peter, James, and John that his soul was overwhelmed with sorrow to point of death, asking them to stay and keep watch with him while he withdrew further into garden to wrestle alone with cup Father had prepared for him to drink. His words revealed profound humanity of one who was fully divine, showing that incarnation meant experiencing complete range of human emotion, including anguish so intense it threatened to crush even divine strength. Revealing that salvation would be accomplished not through divine power that bypassed human suffering, but through divine love that entered fully into human experience, including its darkest moments. Moving beyond even these closest companions, Jesus fell face down on ground in prayer that revealed ultimate submission of divine will to divine purpose, perfect harmony between Father and Son that was willing to embrace even separation for sake of human redemption. The cup he referenced was not merely physical death, but spiritual agony of bearing humanity's sin, experiencing separation from divine love that sin creates, drinking full measure of divine wrath against human rebellion, while maintaining perfect love for those whose rebellion he was taking upon himself. 3 times he prayed this prayer, and 3 times he returned to find his disciples sleeping, unable to keep watch with him during his hour of greatest need, their failure revealing human inability to comprehend or participate in depth of what divine love was willing to endure for their salvation. His gentle rebuke revealed not anger, but loneliness that made his suffering even more profound. Isolation that comes when those we love most cannot stay present with us in our darkest moments of testing and trial. As Jesus emerged from his final time of prayer, strengthened by angelic ministry, but confirmed in his commitment to drink cup his Father had prepared for him, sound of approaching footsteps and flickering torches broke garden's sacred silence. Judas arrived leading crowd of soldiers and temple guards, armed with swords and clubs as if they were arresting dangerous criminal rather than teacher whose only weapons had been words of love and acts of compassion, whose only crime had been demonstrating divine mercy in ways that threatened earthly power structures. The betrayal was accomplished through kiss, traditional greeting between rabbi and disciple perverted into signal for arrest, intimacy weaponized for treachery, trust transformed into most infamous act of betrayal in human history. Yet even in this moment of ultimate rejection, Jesus called Judas friend, extending grace to very one who was delivering him to his enemies, offering love even to heart that had chosen silver over loyalty, temporary gain over eternal treasure. When Peter drew sword and cut off ear of high priest's servant, Jesus immediately rebuked this attempt at violent resistance, healing wounded man even as his own captors bound his hands, demonstrating mercy toward enemies even in moment of his arrest. His words revealed different kind of power than world understood, kingdom that advances through love rather than force, victory that comes through surrender rather than conquest, strength that expresses itself through service rather than domination. The trials that followed were travesties of justice from beginning to end, conducted by religious leaders who had already decided on their verdict and were merely seeking legal justification for predetermined conclusion. They brought forward false witnesses whose testimonies contradicted each other, asked trick questions designed to entrap Jesus into statements that could be construed as blasphemy or sedition, and ultimately condemned him for crime of claiming to be who he actually was, Son of Divine Love. When high priest demanded direct answer about his identity, Jesus knew that answering truthfully would seal his fate, but he could not deny who he was to save his life. "You have said so," he replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest's dramatic response, tearing his clothes and declaring this blasphemy, revealed spiritual blindness so complete that divine truth appeared to be ultimate falsehood. The Roman trial before Pontius Pilate revealed political dimensions of Jesus' execution, as religious charges of blasphemy were translated into accusations of sedition and treason that might concern imperial authorities. When Pilate questioned Jesus about his kingship, Jesus' response revealed fundamental difference between his mission and any earthly political agenda, explaining that his kingdom was not of this world, that if it were, his servants would fight to prevent his arrest. But his kingdom was from another place entirely. Pilate's repeated declarations that he found no basis for charges against Jesus, his attempts to release him through various legal maneuvers, his symbolic hand-washing to disclaim responsibility for execution he was nevertheless authorizing, all revealed tragic consequences of choosing political expedience over moral courage, personal preservation over standing for truth and justice, when such stands require personal cost and sacrifice. The Roman soldiers' mockery of Jesus before his crucifixion, placing crown of thorns on his head and purple robe on his shoulders while they beat and spat on him, was intended as ridicule of false king, but actually constituted unwitting worship of true king, whose throne would be cross and whose crown would indeed be thorns, but whose kingdom would outlast every earthly empire that ever risen or would ever rise. The crucifixion itself represented most excruciating form of execution ancient world had devised, designed not merely to kill but to torture, to humiliate, to serve as public deterrent to anyone who might consider opposing Roman authority. Yet in divine providence, this instrument of torture and shame became means by which divine love made its ultimate statement about human worth, altar on which perfect sacrifice was offered for imperfect humanity. Even in his agony, Jesus' words from cross revealed heart that remained focused on others rather than his own suffering, offering forgiveness to his executioners, paradise to repentant thief crucified beside him, provision for his mother's care, and ultimately triumphant declaration that his mission was accomplished. The work of redemption was complete, price of human sin fully paid, way open for anyone to approach divine love without fear of rejection or condemnation. Chapter 14. The promise fulfilled in profound silence that followed Jesus' death. Silence broken only by weeping of those who loved him and awed whispers of witnesses who recognized they had observed something unprecedented. Very fabric of creation seemed to hold its breath as earth and heaven processed completion of most significant event in human history, voluntary sacrifice of divine love for human redemption. Payment of infinite price for eternal freedom of anyone willing to receive such extravagant grace through simple faith and grateful surrender. The Roman centurion who supervised crucifixion, professional soldier accustomed to witnessing death in its most brutal forms, found himself compelled to acknowledge what he had observed, declaring that surely this was righteous man, and according to some accounts, truly this man was son of divine love. Even this hardened military officer, trained to maintain emotional distance from suffering he was required to oversee, could not remain unmoved by manner of Jesus' death, forgiveness he had extended to his executioners, dignity he had maintained throughout his ordeal. As evening approached and Sabbath drew near, Joseph of Arimathea, wealthy member of ruling council who had been secret follower of Jesus, found courage to request permission from Pilate to bury body properly rather than allowing it to be thrown into common grave reserved for executed criminals. This was act of considerable bravery that publicly identified him with condemned man and could have cost him his position, his reputation, and possibly his life. But love compelled him to ensure that Jesus received honorable burial befitting his true identity. Together with Nicodemus, another member of religious establishment who had come to Jesus under cover of darkness, seeking spiritual truth, and had apparently found more than he had expected, Joseph carefully removed Jesus' body from cross and prepared it for burial according to Jewish custom. They wrapped body in linen cloths with expensive spices and placed it in new tomb that Joseph had prepared for his own eventual use, carved out of rock in garden near place of crucifixion. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee, watching from distance as he died and noting carefully where his body was laid, planned to return after Sabbath to complete burial preparations that had been performed hastily due to time constraints imposed by approaching Holy Day observances. Their devotion compelled them to perform this final act of love for Teacher who had transformed their lives, even though their hearts were breaking with grief and their faith was shattered by apparent failure of everything they had believed and hoped. The religious authorities, remembering Jesus' predictions about rising from dead on third day, requested that Pilate post guards at tomb and seal it officially to prevent disciples from stealing body and claiming resurrection had occurred. Pilate granted their request, and Roman soldiers were stationed with orders to prevent any disturbance, their very presence serving ironically to make coming miracle more undeniable, and their precautions more obviously inadequate against divine power. The Sabbath passed in crushing sorrow for Jesus' followers, who huddled together behind locked doors, overwhelmed by grief and confusion, struggling to process apparent collapse of everything they had given their lives to follow. Their dreams of his kingdom being established seemed to have died with him on cross, their hopes for liberation and restoration apparently buried with his body in sealed tomb, their understanding of divine purpose shattered by events that contradicted every expectation they had formed about Messiah's mission. But while they mourned what appeared to be ultimate defeat, something unprecedented was stirring in tomb where Jesus' body had been laid. Something that would transform their grief into joy, their despair into hope, their confusion into clarity about divine love's ultimate victory over every force that opposes human flourishing and divine purpose. Death, which had seemed to have final word in story of divine love's encounter with human need, was about to be revealed as merely temporary interruption in eternal relationship between Creator and creation. Early on first day of week, before dawn had fully broken over Jerusalem, Mary Magdalene made her way to tomb carrying spices to anoint Jesus' body. Her heart heavy with sorrow, but her devotion compelling her to perform this final act of service for one who had freed her from demonic oppression and given her life meaning and purpose she had never imagined possible. She expected to find tomb sealed and guarded, body of her beloved Teacher still wrapped in burial cloths, finality of death confirmed by sight of his lifeless form. But when she arrived at garden tomb, she discovered something that challenged every assumption about permanence of death and limitation of divine power. Massive stone that had sealed entrance was rolled away, not from outside as if someone had broken in, but from inside as if someone had broken out, lying at an angle that suggested it had been moved not by human strength, but by supernatural force that made its weight irrelevant. Angels, whose very presence transformed tomb into sanctuary of divine glory, greeted her bewilderment with words that would echo through eternity, asking why she looked for living among dead and announcing that he was not there but had risen, just as he said. Their invitation to come and see place where he lay, then go quickly and tell disciples that he had risen from dead, transformed tomb from place of ending into place of beginning, from symbol of defeat into evidence of victory, beyond anything human hearts had dared to hope. When Mary ran to tell disciples what she had found, her words tumbled over each other in excitement and confusion as she struggled to communicate experience that transcended ordinary language and challenged fundamental assumptions about nature of reality. Peter and John raced to tomb to verify her report, their hearts pounding with mixture of hope and disbelief as their feet carried them toward evidence that would either confirm their worst fears or exceed their wildest dreams. John arrived first but waited for Peter at entrance, and Peter characteristically rushed inside to examine evidence firsthand, seeing linen cloths lying undisturbed and facecloth folded neatly by itself, everything arranged with care that suggested purposeful departure rather than hasty theft. John followed Peter into empty tomb and saw same evidence, but his response was different. He saw and believed. Careful arrangement of grave clothes, obvious absence of body, supernatural nature of what had occurred all combined to convince John that Jesus had indeed risen from dead, that death had been conquered by divine love, that hope was not only restored but vindicated in most wonderful way imaginable. Later that same day, Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene as she wept outside tomb. Speaking her name in familiar voice, she had learned to love and follow, revealing himself as alive and victorious over death itself. Her joy at recognizing him was tempered only by his instruction not to cling to him, as he had not yet ascended to Father, but to go and tell disciples that he was alive, and that their relationship with divine love had been transformed through his sacrifice and resurrection. That evening, as disciples gathered behind locked doors, paralyzed by fear of what religious authorities might do to them now that their master was gone, Jesus appeared among them with words that transformed their terror into overwhelming joy, greeting them with peace and showing them his hands inside, proving his identity through wounds of crucifixion, while demonstrating that his resurrection was complete restoration to life. Not mere spiritual survival, but bodily triumph over death itself. Chapter 15. Until we meet again in peace. Here at gentle conclusion of our sacred journey together through life and love of Jesus Christ. As peaceful darkness of night settles around you like most comforting embrace, and your breathing naturally deepens into rhythm of blessed rest, I want to pause with you in profound gratitude for these precious hours we have shared, walking together through most beautiful and transformative story ever told. Experiencing together love that has changed countless hearts across centuries and continues to change hearts tonight, including your own precious heart that has been touched by divine grace in ways that will echo through your tomorrows. We began this evening with you carrying whatever burdens today had placed upon your shoulders, perhaps feeling weary beyond words, possibly questioning your worth, or wondering if there truly existed love in this universe that knew your name and cared about your deepest needs and longest struggles. We conclude with you held securely in embrace of that very love, surrounded by truth that you have never been alone and never could be alone, because you are cherished beyond measure by one who spoke galaxies into existence, yet numbers every hair on your head, who sustains entire cosmos, yet pays attention to every whispered prayer and silent longing of your heart. The Jesus we have encountered together in these quiet hours is not merely figure from ancient history, confined to pages of old books or memories of bygone civilizations, but living presence who reaches across every barrier of time and space to touch tired hearts exactly like yours, to offer rest to weary souls exactly like yours, to extend forgiveness and acceptance to imperfect people exactly like you and me. His love transcends historical boundaries and cultural limitations to meet you in your present circumstances, speaking to your contemporary struggles with sane voice that calmed storms and comforted mourners 2,000 years ago. The cross we witnessed together was not simply tragic end to beautiful life, but ultimate demonstration of divine love, willing to pay any price for human redemption. Definitive proof that there is no depth of human need that divine grace cannot reach, no darkness so profound that divine light cannot penetrate it, no heart so broken that divine love cannot heal it completely. The resurrection we celebrated revealed that this love is not merely beautiful sentiment, but victorious power, not wishful thinking but eternal reality, not temporary comfort, but permanent transformation available to anyone willing to receive it with simple faith. If this sacred journey has brought even moment of genuine peace to your troubled heart, if these ancient stories have awakened something beautiful in your spirit that had been sleeping under weight of disappointment and discouragement, if you have found yourself breathing more freely or feeling more connected to love that holds universe together, then you have discovered treasure worth guarding, worth returning to whenever life becomes overwhelming, worth sharing with others who are searching for same peace you have found tonight. This community of fellow seekers that has formed around these contemplative stories represents something precious and rare in our modern world. Gathering of hearts that understand rest is sacred, that recognize peace as revolutionary, that choose contemplation over constant activity as wiser path toward what matters most in human existence. By joining our family through subscription, you become part of something that transcends mere content consumption, entering into fellowship with people who have discovered that slowing down reveals more truth than speeding up, that silence teaches more wisdom than noise, that some realities can only be perceived when we create space for them to settle into hearts prepared by stillness and surrender. Your voice matters tremendously in this sacred conversation we are having together across continents and cultures. Your reflections and experiences adding unique threads to tapestry of testimony that encourage every heart that encounters it. Please share with us in comments below what this journey has meant to you. What particular moments in Jesus' story have spoken most directly to your own need? What peace has been awakened in places of your heart that had grown accustomed to anxiety or fear? There is no requirement for profound theological insights or perfect spiritual understanding, simply invitation to share whatever these hours have stirred in your soul, knowing that your honesty creates permission for others to be equally authentic about their own struggles and discoveries. Sometimes people hesitate to engage with spiritual content online, wondering if their faith is strong enough or their questions too simple or their understanding too limited to contribute meaningfully to conversations about divine love and eternal truth. But remember, disciples we have observed throughout these stories, ordinary men with extraordinary flaws who asked obvious questions and made embarrassing mistakes, yet were chosen by Jesus and entrusted with most important message in human history because their hearts remained open to transformation through divine grace. Your questions reveal seeking heart, and seeking hearts are exactly what divine love delights to find and satisfy with truth that brings both comfort and challenge. Your struggles connect you to universal human experience of wrestling with doubt and disappointment, and sharing those struggles gives others courage to acknowledge their own need for kind of love that never fails or abandons those who turn to it in their desperation. Your discoveries, however small they might seem to you, testify to reality of divine love working in contemporary hearts, proving that Jesus we have encountered in these ancient stories continues to transform lives in our modern world. In weeks and months ahead, we will continue exploring stories that possess power to heal wounded hearts and restore hope to discouraged spirits. Journeying together through experiences of saints and mystics who discovered divine presence in desert silences and mountain solitudes, learning how their encounters with divine love can illuminate our own spiritual paths and provide practical wisdom for contemporary challenges. We will meditate on psalms and prayers that have sustained believers through persecution and prosperity, through seasons of abundance and times of desperate need, always finding in them fresh resources for whatever difficulties or joys we may be facing. Each story we explore together will be crafted with same loving care as tonight's journey, designed to help you transition from whatever anxieties have marked your day to blessing of peaceful rest that comes from knowing you are completely loved, always intended to remind you that you are precious beyond your ability to comprehend, always created to serve as bridge between chaos of worldly concerns and tranquility of divine grace that surrounds you whether you are conscious of it or not. Feel now how your body has naturally released every remaining tension, how your breathing has slowed to gentle rhythm of someone who knows they are safe in arms that will never grow weary of holding them, how your heart has found its natural pace of rest and presence of love that requires nothing from you except your willingness to be loved without reservation or condition. You don't need to understand everything about divine truth to benefit from its reality. Don't need to have perfect faith to receive perfect love. Don't need to achieve spiritual maturity before you can rest in spiritual grace. As sleep begins to claim your consciousness, carrying you from wakefulness into blessed unconsciousness where divine love continues its healing work in regions of your soul too deep for words or awareness to reach. Let your final conscious thoughts be filled with gratitude for this time we have shared, for love you have encountered, for peace that has taken root in your heart like seed that will continue growing even while you sleep, producing fruit of joy and hope and renewed strength for whatever tomorrow may bring. You are falling asleep tonight, not merely into natural rest, but into everlasting arms that have held every believer who has ever found peace in divine love, every heart that has ever been healed by divine grace, every soul that has ever discovered their true identity as beloved children of the One who created them for relationship with Himself and destines them for eternal joy in His presence. Your sleep tonight participates in rest that Jesus promised to all who come to Him with their burdens, rest that restores not just physical energy but spiritual vitality, not just bodily strength, but soul satisfaction. Dream peaceful dreams tonight, dear friend. Dreams filled with love we have explored together. Visions of grace that surrounds you. Glimpses of hope that now burns steadily in your heart like candle that no wind can extinguish and no darkness can overcome. When morning comes, you will awaken not only refreshed in body, but renewed in spirit. Not only rested from today's labors, but prepared for tomorrow's opportunities to experience and express love that has claimed you as its own. May peace of Christ, which surpasses all human understanding, guard your heart and mind through this night and always. May you rest secure in knowledge that you are loved with everlasting love, accepted with unconditional grace, and held by hands that will never let you go regardless of what storms may rage around you or what challenges may test your faith. May your days ahead be filled with growing awareness of divine presence, your nights with peaceful rest in divine love, your entire life with joy that comes from knowing you belong to love that will never end. Sweet dreams, precious child of divine love. Sleep well in love that conquered death, grace that makes all things new, hope that anchors souls through every storm, and leads them safely home to heart of divine love, where every tear is wiped away and every sorrow is transformed into eternal joy. Until we meet again in this sacred space where weary hearts find rest, may you know beyond any doubt that you are beloved, you are precious, you are exactly who divine love created you to be. And you are destined for more beauty and joy than your heart can currently imagine. Rest now in perfect peace, surrounded by perfect love, held by perfect grace that covers every imperfection and transforms every weakness into strength, every failure into learning, every ending into new beginning, filled with possibilities as infinite as love that created you, and will never stop believing in wonderful person you are becoming through divine transformation, working patiently and persistently in depths of your being. Good night, dear one. May angels watch over your sleep and divine love fill your dreams until morning brings fresh mercies and new opportunities to experience grace that is always flowing toward you like river that never runs dry, like spring that never fails, like love that never ends. We will journey together again soon through more stories of grace, more encounters with divine love, more moments of sacred rest for souls that need comfort only divine presence can provide. But for now, simply rest, simply receive, simply be held by love that is stronger than death and more enduring than time itself. Amen and amen. Beloved friend, sleep peacefully in arms of infinite love until we meet again.